Well, last week, Phil, we were saddened by the news of the passing of one of our friends and certainly a much-loved Melbourne personality in Frank Rich.
Yes, he died at the age of 80 and would be perhaps best known on television for his role as Luigi Spittiker.
And who better could we choose to speak of Frank as a friend and a workmate than Bert Newton, who's agreed to speak to us tonight on Remember When. Good evening to you, Bert.
Good evening, boys.
Hi, champ. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. I've got a note here. I thought you wanted to talk about the Titanic.
No, we've already done that in the first hour. Rick Milne is with us, Bert.
How are you, Bert?
Hello, Rick. How are you?
Bert, if I'm not mistaken, I've had a couple of programs from, I think, the Plaza Theatre in Northcote, where Frank starred in his very early days, pre-TV. Would that be right?
Yes, it's spot on. As a matter of fact, the Plaza was a very important part of Frank's life, not only because he was one of the regular stars there, and indeed I used to see him regularly. It was a Change fortnightly program at the Plaza in the early 50s, but also it was the place where he met his lovely wife, Dale. She was the soubrette there, as they used to call them back in those days. She was the singer, and they married 38 years ago after a pretty quick and interesting courtship, and they were together for those 38 years. And of all the married couples that I know in show business, or indeed in life generally, I've never known two people to be quite as much in love after 30 years.
But Frank started his career as a singing waiter, did he not?
Well, actually, Bruce, he had a very interesting life. He had a very hard life in a lot of respects. He was born, he's not quite 80, actually. His 80th birthday occurs a little later this year. But in the 79 years, or nearly 80 years that he spent on this earth, not all of those years were easy ones for a whole range of reasons. His mother died when he was 2 years of age. His father died when he was in his early teens. And Frank went on the road. He humped his bluey when he was a teenager, went right around Australia to get a quid because, of course, we had a depression. We had hard times generally anyway. A lot of people say the depression was a pretty rugged time. Of course, the years before and after the depression weren't all that easy either. He then joined the army and he fought overseas, was captured in Singapore, and spent in excess of 3 years in Changi. He had a broken marriage. He was married twice in his life, but I think in actual fact, in fairness to Frank and Dale, I think they both consider that they were really married only once. They both had first partners before they met each other. And I think that what I've got to say is that after all of those dreadful things that happened right throughout his life, the one good thing about Frank Rich was he was never a complainer. He was just simply one of the nicest men I've ever met, and I'm delighted to have the memory of him as a close friend. And I think in the last 20 years of his life, maybe 30 years of his life indeed, including his time with Dale, they were his best years because he enjoyed a lot of success in radio and television, and he was never one to look back in terms of complaining about what had been given him. But I think lesser people would have stumbled very early in the piece if they'd had one of those things occur to them.
But wasn't he associated with the Galley and Coffee Lounge in St Kilda for a time?
I think he may have been. I don't think he was... Yeah, I'm sure he was there, Phil, but I don't know whether he was a regular for a lot of time. The things that Frank and I talked about a lot in terms of show business in the past were the Green Mill. He sang there. He sang with Bob Gibson's orchestra. He did a lot of radio. He was a singing waiter, as you rightly say, Bruce. He worked in Sydney too. The Sydney area of his career really hasn't been talked about much this week, but it was pretty important to him. He worked at all the big clubs there, some illegal, some totally legal in terms of booze. But his television and radio days were primarily, I think, the things that he was proudest of. But when I say proud, and actually, he's one of those people that really was never happy with any performance that he gave. Apart from being a wonderful human being, Frank was a man who was very insular in many respects, and he was totally modest, the likes of which I've not seen in show business before, and it quite often surprised me that he went so well in show business. His talent was undoubted, but his attitude was such a quiet, ordinary, in the strictest sense of the word, attitude that it doesn't usually work in show business. Know what I'm saying?
Yes, it's absolutely true. He didn't have that sort of, not big-headed approach, but an ego.
Yeah, he certainly was not ego-driven. His humility, I think, came through not only in his performances, but also the fact that he was the sort of bloke who would do anything for another person. And invariably, when you got into conversation with Frank, he was more inclined to talk about the good deeds of others rather than himself. He's the sort of bloke that I would imagine that could be painted very easily as the typical Australian of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, the likes of which you don't really see all that much now, because we've moved on to other things, I suppose, and it's a very different world. But in terms of versatility in show business, I can't think of anyone who could do more than Frank. He was a fine singer. He was billed as Australia's Bing Crosby back in the 30s. Actually, the thing that the war did to Frank, apart from obviously knocking him around physically and mentally, especially those years, of course, in Changi, the thing the war did uppermost to his show business career, it stopped it in full flight. And I've got a feeling that just after the war, Frank had it pretty hard in getting back into Civvy Street in terms of show business. I'm told lots of performers had difficulty because show business is such an unusual industry, because they were away for, in his case, I think about 5 years. Don't hold me to that. Lots of other people had come through. Show business had changed. There was much more radio work to be done after the war than before the war, and I don't think before the war he'd done a lot of radio work. So that was the hard time for him. But then when he got into the 50s and the 60s and the 70s with television, he was a regular in Bell Bird. He was in the first situation comedy on television, a program called Take That, which was a Hector Crawford production, in which he co-starred with Philip Stainton, the late English actor, and Joff Allen, Irene Hewitt, and Keith Eden. And that was new groundbreaking back in the late 50s. Then he moved across to Channel 9 and worked with Graham and myself on In Melbourne Tonight. Actually, he preceded me there. He was there before I arrived on the scene. And he's a singer, and he could dance. He was a wonderful comedian. And both on television and radio and on the stage and away from the industry, he was a wonderful raconteur. As you blokes well know, that a joke in the wrong hands is a dreadful thing. But in the hands of Frank Rich, it became a real joy. He was a wonderful storyteller. Some of my happiest memories of Frank are being in the company of his wife Dale and himself, and just listening to them talk about the old days in show business and the old gags and the times. And then Frank would invariably go into, not a routine, he wasn't the sort of person who got up and did a routine for you, but he'd go into some stories and some anecdotes, and nobody that I've met in life could tell a story quite like Frank did.
After hearing you and Frank on a radio program on 3UZ many years ago, he did an impersonation of Roy Reen, the likes of which I've never heard before or since. It was wonderful.
Well, once again, Bruce, an impression of Roy Reen in the wrong hands is, inclined to make you want to throw up. With Frank Rich, he did such a beautiful impression. The two best impressions of Roy Reen that I've heard were by Frank Rich and the late writer Freddie Parsons. They were wonderful. Freddie, of course, was Roy's scriptwriter and knew Roy very well. Actually, Frank told a beautiful story about Roy Reen. Do you have time?
Yes, certainly.
I won't do the impression for the reasons I've just mentioned, but just after the war, Roy Reen Moe was very kind to Frank and tried to get him lots of work and succeeded in doing so. Not that his talent wouldn't get him work, but for the reasons I've given already, the war really ate into his show business career. One day they were coming out of a pub in Sydney, right opposite the Macquarie Auditorium, and of course you would know that George Wallace and Roy Reen Moe, who were the two big comics of that era, the 40s and the 50s, loathed each other. And Roy and Frank walked out of the hotel, and there was a sign opposite saying, it was outside 2GB, the George Wallace Show, admission free. And Roy Reen Moe had a look at the sign, looked at Frank, and said, still a bit dear.
That's apparently, if this is true, Bert, a lovely story, Frank Rich, towards the end, was a little bitter that he hadn't received the recognition which he thought he deserved, in life.
Where would you hear that from?
I heard that from a writer recently.
Well, you asked the writer to get in touch with me, because that was bitterness, and that sort of attitude just wasn't in Frank Rich's character. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned before, I think he needed some of that. I think he needed in his makeup some some of, not bitterness, but the ability to fight for himself. But no, I've seen a lot of Frank and talked to Frank a hell of a lot in the last 4 or 5, 6 years, and never once did I hear him complain. He just wasn't that sort of person. As I say, I mean, I would like the writer to get in touch with me, because that's just simply not true. Anything but that. He wasn't that sort of person.
But, Rick again, do you think his tough early life may have had something to do with his, if you like, the fact that he survived for such a long time in a very tough business? I mean, do you think that sort of set him up for his later days?
Yeah, I think it did to a certain extent, Rick, but I still think his talent got him where he finished up in radio and television and the theatre. The thing about Frank Rich was that he had very definite ideas. He was a very political man. He strongly supported the Labor Party. He was a spiritual man, and yet he wasn't in the strictest sense a religious man, but he had a great sense of what was spiritually right. I don't even know how you'd categorise Frank. He certainly, he wasn't an atheist, but if he was an agnostic or perhaps not a total true believer religiously, I would suggest that the Christian church in the world needs more Frank Rich type people, because whether he liked it or not and whether he knew it or not, he was a living example of what a Christian should be. He was just fantastic in what he did for people, and he would stop doing things for people if they made it public. And that's what I found so endearing about Frank Rich. The thing is that a couple of performers in the business have been in contact with me the last couple of days, wondering why they couldn't have gone to his funeral. Frank was such a private man, and he and his wife Dale, Frank, I guess we're all dying, but Frank knew a number of years ago, 5, 6 years ago, that time was limited. Actually, in fairness, I think that he probably had 6 years that the doctors wouldn't have given him. But toward the end, obviously, arrangements had to be made, and one of the requests was that it be a private funeral, because he was such a private man. And I think he'd been to a couple of show business funerals that concerned him just a little, because all of a sudden they became circuses. And the people there at the funeral on Thursday, he included his very close friends, mainly away from show business. I'm just trying to think there. Patty and I were there, and Peggy and Stan Schluter from Queensland. Peggy Ryan, was a wonderful dancer. Still is, actually, still works. And she and Dale were together many years ago, in Queensland particularly. They were there, and I just really can't think of any other performers who went to the funeral, which also says something about Frank. He loved people in show business, but he spent more time with people away from it, certainly in later years anyway.
But I associate the song Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries with Frank. Was that his signature?
That was his big one. Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams.
Oh, yes.
Song of the Clyde, I think it's called. Perhaps it should be mentioned, Philip, and you will certainly remember this because you were there at the time, and I guess Bruce too. That's the true example of Frank's versatility was that in Melbourne Tonight, apart from appearing in lots of commercials and as characters, I think Frank was always very, very comfortable when he was playing a character, more than just being himself. But apart from commercials and comedy sketches and things, Frank had a regular singing spot on in Melbourne Tonight. As I mentioned before, in the 30s, he was billed as Australia's Bing Crosby. My favourite record of Frank is him doing Sweet Leilani. Unfortunately, he didn't agree with me. He didn't think it was a particularly good record, but I thought it was fantastic. And when I was doing the morning program on 3UZ, I played it quite regularly. I think maybe in his heart of hearts, he didn't think it was all that bad. But once again, referring to the sort of bloke that he was, he certainly wasn't going to tell me that he liked it.
Yes. Well, on that note, we'll say thank you, Bert, for spending some time with us on Sunday night. I speak on behalf of Rick Milne.
Thanks, Bert. That was wonderful.
And Phil.
A very fitting tribute, Bert. Thank you for delivering it.
I loved him so much, I was thrilled that you asked me to talk about him.
Thank you, Bert, very much indeed. Good night.
Good night now.